everybody. Thank you so much for being here today. It's good to see you. I appreciate your support. Most of you, I think, know that my name is Daphne Taylor Garcia, and I am a Chicana living here on Kumeyaay land. UCSD was built on the unceded territory of the Kumeyaay Nation, for which we work to establish the conditions for reparations. I am also here in capacity of Director of the Critical Gender Studies program and am the proud host of this year's Papadopoulus Lecture. The Papadopoulus Lecture Series is funded by the family of UCSD alumnus Nicholas Papadopoulos. He was a student here who later passed away from complications due to AIDS in the 1990s, and his family asked that this lecture series be established in his name, to remember him by. And so through the generosity of that family, this annual lecture is made possible. And so this year we have our guest here. Dr. Jennifer Lisa Vest is, as I wrote in the announcement, as you know, is a two-spirit Afro-Indigenous poet and philosopher. She has had a fascinating academic journey from an undergraduate degree in physics at Hampshire College, a master's degree in history at Howard University, a PhD in ethnic studies, and then receiving tenure in a philosophy department in the University of Central Florida. And I first met Dr. Vest, we were trying to figure out probably about 20 years ago. We both went to Berkeley, but we were not there at the same time, but our circles have overlapped since then. And there are two poets that this is the first work that I read by Jennifer, was her poetry. And there are two poets that have really impacted me in my life. And as an undergraduate student, it was Christos, and as a postdoc, it was Jennifer Lisa Vest's work. If your everyday life traverses the bounds of racial and gendered categories, then you know how difficult it can be to find literature that reflects your experience, right? Especially in the fullness of it, right? I mean, you might find a piece of yourself here, another piece of yourself over there, but to see yourself reflected in literature can be quite difficult. And so I did find that in Jennifer's work. And so I have been inspired and influenced, by her scholarship and poetry, since I have been reading it. And so I was very excited and happy, that this book has been published. Sovereign Wisdom is a brilliant and much needed book that shows us a way out of the Western knowledge, traditional knowledge binary that can often foreclose the possibility of Native American academic philosophy and Indigenous academic philosophies more broadly. Jennifer Lisa Vest has also made important contributions to Caribbean philosophy, African philosophy, and so this is one latest contribution, that we're lucky to hear about today. And so with that, I am very happy and proud to introduce you to Dr. Vest.
Thank you so much. Chian Tamo, greetings. I hope you can hear me. I'm honored to be invited here to speak to you today, and I want to give a special thanks to Professor Daphne Taylor Garcia and the Critical Gender Studies program for the invitation. I'd like to acknowledge the Kumeyaay, whose land I stand on. I'm not from here. I'm from Chicago. As an Afro-Indigenous person, I have people from many places, including parts of Africa, Haiti, Germany, and from the Seminole peoples of northern Florida. My grandmother was from Miccosukee-speaking Seminole band in northern Florida, Wind Clan. I must begin by admitting that I find the prospect of talking about my book, Sovereign Wisdom, a bit daunting. I spent so much of my life working on it that this book talk feels akin to taking my child and holding it up for the community to pray over. Equal parts pride and embarrassment. Who am I to celebrate this thing that I have created? Am I even capable of explaining it? This book began as an answer to a question I was told not to ask. And a part of me is still looking over my shoulders for the crows coming for me, telling me I am wrong to even have tried. My question was this: could there be such a thing as academic Native American philosophy? I first asked this question in my 20s. I'm now in my 50s. I wrote this book as an answer, one answer. And in asking this question, many other questions came up. This book is mostly metaphilosophical. It is philosophy about philosophy, as silly as that sounds. It attempts to answer the question of academic Native American philosophy by asking, what is philosophy? It also attempts to answer the question by asking, what is philosophy for Native people? Before I get into my book, a quick comment on my queerness, because I did my due diligence and looked up the previous speakers invited to the Papadopoulus series and noted that all of your previous speakers gave lectures on explicitly queer topics. So I want to manage expectations with regard to my talk. I am speaking of a book I wrote, and that book is not primarily focused on queerdom. It's a philosophy book written by a two-spirit queer author and has certain queer elements understood primarily through an Indigenous lens. But neither the topic of the book nor the topic of this talk is queerness per se. But it could be argued that my queerness predisposed me to write such a book. For as a Black, Native American, two-spirit, genderqueer, lesbian scholar, I often found myself situated in spaces that were not made for bodies or perspectives like mine. Philosophy is the whitest discipline, and my existence in the field was necessarily problematic in a multitude of ways. White men questioned my right to even exist in the field and found it difficult to engage my scholarship on Native American and African philosophies without always first asking whether my scholarship was even possible. The African and African American philosophers I spent time with were all male at the time that I was in the field. We weren't there yet. The Black women weren't there yet. And they found me fascinating, but my gender and my sexuality were seen as troubling. Native American philosophers questioned my mixedness at the same time that every single one of them was mixed, because somehow being a white mixed Indian is not the same as being a Black mixed Indian. And then the queer philosophy scene I encountered was at that time 100% white. Given my occupation of a standpoint that placed me both inside and outside numerous borders and communities within the field, it was perhaps inevitable that I would be the type of philosopher to focus on tearing down the discipline brick by brick, questioning its very foundation, and proposing entirely new ways to pursue wisdom. All of my work has been that type of work, whether in Caribbean, African, or feminist philosophy. It's always been about that. To be queer, to be mixed blood, to be the descendant of a people who, in my grandmother's words, were never defeated, never signed a treaty, and never lived on a reservation, gave me a perspective that was necessarily critical of and questioning of intellectual traditions. To be mixed and queer is to be hyper-aware of the constructions that people cling to with such ferocity. My positionality allowed me to be able to see through the veneers, to poke at the traditions and ask why. Now to my book. In my book, I propose a methodology for formulating a sovereign field of academic Native American philosophy. And bear with me, I'm going to be reading a lot from the book because it's already written. So I didn't have to rewrite. And so I want to talk first about why I thought this was important to do. I guess I should use my glasses. We are all related. Existence is mutually co-constructive. Land is important to the formulation of ideas. Words have power and causal agency. Everything is alive. Balance in all things is important. Every being has a purpose. Humility is important. Knowledge entails responsibility, and we must accept the inscrutable nature of mystery. Ideas such as these recur in the writings, sayings, orations, and ceremonies of Native Americans across nation, tribe, gender, age, geography, and status. Any effort to define an academic discourse of Native American philosophy that is intellectually sovereign must engage these recurrent themes. It is the project of this book to propose a specific method for generating academic Native American philosophy. The creation of the field is important for precisely the same reason that philosophy as a discipline is important. Its existence aids humanity in the pursuit of wisdom, and it aids that pursuit in particular by interrogating the wisdom traditions of Indigenous Native Americans, something that has only recently begun to be done. Now, I've come up with 5 reasons, but I'm just going to discuss a couple of them. Because of the historic and ongoing Eurocentrism of U.S. North American philosophy, newer fields of philosophy are often constrained to debates with Europe and Anglo-philosophic literatures. The development and growth of academic Native American philosophy encourages the creation of South-South dialogues between African and Native, Asian and Native American, Caribbean and Native American, Indigenous Australian and Native American, Asian, etc. And this is a new dialogic that can replace the historic West versus the rest dialogue. Another reason why this is important is because the creation of academic Native American philosophy lays not just in its metaphilosophical value, but in its value to other fields in Native American studies. It's an important voice largely absent in Native American studies circles where works in literature, history, and political science are dominant. Native American studies scholars could benefit from a dialogue with philosophers. Another justification for this project lays in its decolonial potential. According to Canadian Indigenous writer Lee Miracle, quote, "The expropriation of the accumulated knowledge of Native peoples is one legacy of colonization. Decolonization will require the repatriation and rematriation of that knowledge by Native peoples themselves," unquote. The formulation of academic Native American philosophy can form a part of that rematriation process that aids decolonization. And decolonization is necessary for sovereignty. And so this formulation is an intellectually sovereign formulation that can aid in decolonization or assist material sovereignty movements as well. Now I want to talk a little bit. I'm not going to be able to go through, everything, so I'm going to summarize some of the things that I cover in the various chapters. But first, let me talk a little bit about the goals of the project. The project is formulated with the primary intention of generating questions and dialogue. So the text is to encourage thinkers to begin to engage questions that are provoked by these recurrent themes articulated in the context of Native cultures and communities. I've included in my book a large number of quotes from Native thinkers from a variety of backgrounds so that it can be used as a resource for Native philosophers seeking to construct dialogues that are really grounded in the culture. My proposal for this Native American philosophy is guided by 4 specific criteria. 1, the creation of intellectual space for the investigation of and analysis of American Indian ideas. 2, the production of intellectually sovereign scholarship grounded in and beneficial to American Indian cultures. 3, the raising of new, meaningful, and necessary philosophical questions. And 4, the rejuvenation, expansion, and enlargement of the pursuit of wisdom through the creation of new dialogues. And so I just want to point out that, my project is, rethinking the whole field of philosophy. And that's what I think Native philosophy can do for the discipline. Okay, so I'm going to give you a very brief outline of my chapters. And then if you want to know more about them, we can talk about it in the Q&A, and then I'm just going to focus on certain aspects. And so in my first chapter, Difficult but Necessary Problems, I identify 3 types of problems and discuss the way they condition the creation of this field. And I argue that we have to take them seriously to make sure that this project does not become harmful to Native American communities. In the second chapter, I introduce my method, where I talk about the importance of identifying recurrent themes that we can base the field on. In my third chapter, I ask the question, is questioning everything questionable? And I'm going to talk about that more. But that has to do with a critique that I had heard made by Native American scholars about whether or not question asking is a native practice. And chapter 4, when God was a woman, centering women in the discipline, I propose that we need to center women in the formulation of this field. And then chapters 5, 6, and 7 are the chapters where I discuss specific themes, provide the evidence for them, and then ask questions and provide statements based on them. Okay, so the first question I want to address is this question of, is it a good idea? And so I wrote a whole chapter on making it a good idea. And so I'm going to just read briefly from that so you have some idea of the context in which this project was born. So several years ago, when in search of a graduate program, so this is a long time ago, I called up a prominent Native American scholar to ask her, where could I go to do doctoral work in Native American philosophy? To my dismay, she told me not only that such a field did not exist, but also that there were some Indians who did not think it should. A lot of people, she warned me, do not think it is a good idea. 2 decades later, those of us who are endeavoring to create this field, who contend that Native American philosophy should exist, not only in the words and practices of certain Indians, but also in a theoretical field of study, must answer the question, is academic Native American philosophy a good idea? Unlike the majority of the questions posed about the validity or advisability of Indigenous intellectual projects, its origins are not so easily dismissed as racist or presumptuous, in part because disrespectful outsiders are not posing the question. Native Americans are posing it with legitimate cause for concern. It is posed as a respectful question designed to help generate a necessary discussion. So as Native Americans, many of us see our work as necessarily informed by and derived from our individual and collective communities in both their tribal and pan-tribal forms. So when other Native Americans, whether scholars or not, raise questions about whether or not the project is a good idea, we should, I argue, be compelled to listen. And so I listened, and I thought about it for many years. I ended up working through it. And what I did was I came up with an understanding of the 3 sets of problems that we would have to overcome in order to do this project. And what I argue is that if we seriously engage these problems in our work, that we can make it a good idea. And so the whole book is really based on formulating the field in light of these problems. And so I'll just briefly discuss the problems. There are 3 sets of problems that I discuss: problems of conquest, problems of identity, and problems of translation. And I formulated this list as a way to get at those questions people had about the field. Problems of conquest concern the whole complex of actions and beliefs associated with the European conquest of the Americas. These problems affect both the external evaluation made of the conquered by the conquerors and the internalized self-perception of the conquered. Because problems of conquest precede and set the stage for the other 2 sets of problems, they're a good place to start. They manifest in a number of ways, and they condition all dialogue and interaction. From the most brutal physical campaigns of genocide to land seizure to forced acculturation, the conquest has had numerous negative effects on the collective and individual lives of tribal peoples in the Americas. These physical forms of conquest, in turn, have been accompanied by intellectual, cultural, and religious forms of conquest. And it's these later manifestations of conquest that heavily condition the intellectual production, both of Native American scholars and non-Indian scholars writing about Indians. Problems of conquest have a very real effect on contemporary attempts to theorize academic fields of study associated with Native American cultures. And so problems of conquest can manifest in at least 3 ways. There's the problem of intellectual sovereignty, wherein Euro-American scholars are deemed the only legitimate experts on Indian issues, and the effect that Indians are represented as objects of, but not producers of, scholarship. The problem of exploitation, wherein the economic goals of Euro-American scholars, collectors, artists, salesmen, and the representation, interpretation, and commodification of all things culturally Indian condition the intellectual production of Native Americans. And 3, the problem of perverse dialogues, wherein Indian scholars feel compelled to engage in defensive and justificatory dialogues about Native American humanity and intellectual ability. The second set of problems I call problems of identity. And these problems concern the ways in which notions of Indian identity and authenticity affect the intellectual production of Native Americans. They are intrinsically linked to problems of conquest. Questions such as who is an Indian, who can speak for Indians, who can claim to represent Indians, whose voice is authentic, which representations are authentic, all become problematic in theorizing Native American philosophy. How academic Native American philosophy is defined depends upon how Native America is defined. Problems of identity include the following: the problem of historical construction, wherein Indian identity and thus all intellectual production labeled Indian is complicated by the historical, political, and economic needs of the conquest or colonization of the Americas and its concomitant social construction of Indianness and blood quantum. 2, the problem of impersonation, wherein the prevalence of fake Indians and their misrepresentation of Indian culture and politics affect the definitions of Native American issues and thought. And 3, the problem of tradition and politics, wherein internal identity inconsistencies created by the diverse and sometimes contradictory ways in which Native American identity is defined by various Native American individuals, tribes, and pan-tribal urban communities affects definitions of Native American. So there I'm talking about, like, we have traditional notions of identity, and then we have notions of identity created by the efforts to, the termination effort, and then the IRA and the formation of constitutions defined by the federal government. Like, we have different definitions of Indianness that vary over time and also over place. The third set of problems I call problems of translation. And problems of translation manifest in following 4 ways: the problem of language, wherein the difficulties of extrapolating philosophical meaning from language affects efforts to do analyses of tribal sources. Number 2, the problem of orality, where problems arise from efforts that are made to translate oral texts into written texts. 3, the problem of danger and ethics, wherein dangerous consequences can result from the translation of specialized knowledges into public domains and the transfer of powerful knowledge from authorized knowers to unauthorized knowers. And then 4, the problem of multiplicity, wherein the difficulties of reducing a multiplicity of meanings into single static interpretation affects our analysis. And so I created a method, and the method was designed to address these problems. And the method was also designed to satisfy the need for this project to be intellectually sovereign. And so I want to talk briefly about that concept and where it came from. So I'm proposing a method of generating philosophy from recurrent themes in Native American culture. And I argue that we can create a field of study that is philosophically interesting and intellectually sovereign if we follow this methodology. So intellectual sovereignty is a term first coined by Osage literary scholar Robert Warrior in 1992, and later discussed and developed by Indigenous intellectuals Jack Forbes and Inez Hernandez Avila. This project takes seriously their call that we create new Native American discourses guided by a focus on intellectual sovereignty. According to Warrior, quote, "It is now critical for American Indian intellectuals committed to sovereignty to realize that we too must struggle for sovereignty, intellectual sovereignty, and allow the definition and articulation of what that means to emerge as we critically reflect on that struggle. In my own answer to his call, I argue that intellectual sovereignty projects must be built upon Native American intellectual production and ought to be guided by a commitment to the well-being of Native peoples. Generating academic Native American philosophy from recurrent themes is one way to ensure that the project is intellectually sovereign. According to Onondagan clan mother Audrey Shenandoah, quote, "Many people don't understand the word sovereignty. Sovereignty is the ability to carry out your own direction. If you think sovereign," she explains, "you can be sovereign." Academic Native American philosophy, as formulated herein, contributes to the project of what Shenandoah calls thinking sovereign, and thus its creation contributes not only to enlarging the philosophic discourse, but also helps facilitate Indigenous sovereignty movements more generally. And so what is this method? In seeking to define the field, there were a lot of possibilities. And one of the possibilities, which some of my colleagues have chosen, I call path one, is where you just kind of stick with the present definitions. How have Europeans defined philosophy? Let's just kind of add natives and stir. And I argue against that and say, no, we have to go on an indigenous path. We have to find a way to make the philosophy truly native. And the way we do that is we look at, what do natives say is important? What are the important themes? And so this allows us to address these problems of conquest, identity, and translation. And so the method of recurrent themes involves 5 steps. So first, we do an exploration of a large interdisciplinary cross-section of native authored texts in order to identify the existence of recurrent themes. So I spent years and years and years reading everything I could by every Native American who had anything critical to say about culture. And then I did an in-depth search for evidence to support a subset. And I decided to focus on a subset of 10 key recurrent themes. Of course, there's so many more. But I chose 10 because, it's got to fit in a book. And then asking metaphilosophical questions about those themes. So metaphilosophical questions are questions about the nature of philosophy. And just by engaging native culture, we automatically begin to question the whole project of philosophy. And then there's the generation of generative statements. And so we have the themes, and then from that, we create statements, which are more like propositions or arguments. And then once we have these statements, they can be used to either create or defend arguments, provoke questions, or begin dialogues. And in case you're not clear about what I mean by recurrent themes, they're ideas or beliefs that are identified by Native intellectuals, artists, and leaders as important, central, or relevant to Indian communities. They are ideas which are found repeated throughout a diversity of tribal accounts, time periods, genres, and are common to a wide variety of authors and speakers. They are often cited as important, and they are highlighted. So I did that, and I came up with a bunch of themes. I came up with 25, and then I narrowed it down to 10. And so the 10 themes that I talk about in this book are the following. 1, the importance of land and place. 2, the importance of the spoken word and stories. 3, the interconnectedness between all things and people. 4, the aliveness of all things, actually. 5, the importance of respecting all life. 6, the importance of balance and reciprocity. 7, the purposeful existence of all beings. 8, the connection between knowledge and responsibility. 9, the importance of humility. And 10, the importance of mystery or the ineffable. And obviously, we could have picked a whole bunch of other themes instead. But those are the ones I chose to focus on. And it's my hope that other philosophers will add to that, come up with new themes. And maybe they'll come up with themes that are better, right, than the ones I came up with. So in my chapter on Is Questioning Everything Questionable, I was trying to address yet another critique. And so, in case it's not obvious already, what informs my work the most is what Native scholars say, right? So in my text, I do not engage with Euro scholars' critiques. I don't engage with arguments that, we don't have philosophy or our philosophy is not really whatever. Everything in here is a response to questions or critiques that I encountered from other Native scholars. And so this question is questioning everything questionable, was about whether or not it's okay to define philosophy in this context, Native American philosophy, in terms of the asking of questions. And that's how I define it. I define it as reflection, dialogue, and the persistent asking of questions. And so there were a lot of, scholars, Native scholars, who have said, well, I don't know if question asking is really a Native thing. And so in this chapter, I talk about that, and I'll just give one example from Peggy Beck, who was one of the editors of a publication by the Navajo Community College. They wrote this whole book on Native ways of knowing. Some of you may know it. And she argued that in almost all cases, quote, learning the way for Native Americans in classic tribal times meant going directly to the source of the mysteries. The people voyaged with their entire bodies and with all their senses, including language and thought, in order to find the answers to these questions and to aid in their understanding of themselves and their world. In order that knowledge did not get separated from experience, wisdom from divinity, the elders stressed listening and waiting, not asking why. And this is just one of many examples that I discuss. There are also philosophers who say, native thinkers who say, Indians don't make propositional claims. So like Lakota philosophers, Maya Ramirez said, the Lakota-Dakota worldview does not engage in the deliberate establishment and maintenance of consciously articulated propositions of belief. And so there are a number of claims like this. And what I found, so I really reflected on this for a while, and I just started reading widely. And what I found was I found several examples of Native Americans who were engaging in lots of questions. And I went back in time, and I found examples all the way back to the 1600s of documentation of Native Americans engaging in very serious kind of philosophical questioning. And so I critique that, and I say this is not true. These are examples of where it's not true. And then I say, what are some other explanations for why people might think that? And I came up with a number of explanations, and a lot of it has to do with context, right? Because knowledge is contextual. And so people give examples of when you're talking to an elder, you're not supposed to answer questions. If you're a child talking to an adult, you're not supposed to ask questions. If you're a white man, because some of my examples are from the white men who co-wrote biographies of medicine men, because in the 70s, those were the only biographies out there. They were all co-written, right? Fool's Crow, Black Elk, right? There were limits on what they could ask. And so what it turns out to be is that, you can't ask questions in certain circumstances, and certain people can't ask questions of certain people if they don't have the authority to ask those questions. And so then I give examples of Native scholars who actually say, no, it is okay to ask questions, but under these circumstances, right? And I thought that was important to address because, right, we don't want to have a philosophy that I'm calling Native American, and then Native Americans are saying, well, we don't ask questions. And, part of the problem with these kind of generalizations that are made really has to do with this problem of conquest, right? For so long, Native scholars have had to be in this kind of defensive stance, right, of defending and explaining and justifying. Vine Deloria, the grandfather of Native philosophy, most of his work was about that, right? But it had to be at that time because the racism was so bad, and there was such a need for there to be just a foot in the door. Take us seriously, please, right? But I argue we're past that. And so some of these generalizations that people make are really a lot more to do with the context, right, and the kind of colonial situation. And so I say, you know, the historical and colonial context of question asking by non-Indians of Indians has taught indigenous folk to be very cautious, lest their answers be used against them or their tribe. The recurrent theme of knowledge and responsibility may prohibit some people from answering questions and may prevent others from hearing answers. 3, the great import accorded silence as a learning tool may necessitate that more time is spent learning in silence and less time spent asking questions. That doesn't mean you can't ask questions. It means you're silent first, and then you get your answer. My grandmother, she was the master of silence. You know, if we asked, she was a teacher, so she loved answering questions, but if you asked her the wrong question, she would just say nothing. You'd just be sitting there, and that's just it. Oh, I guess I'm not getting that answer. And that's how we learned, right, what was appropriate to ask. The recurrent theme of respect requires that questions be asked respectfully. And so again, sometimes you have to ask questions in a certain way, and so I think a lot of times people mistake that for generally asking questions. So like if you're in a ceremony and you have to ask a question of a ceremonial leader, you'll just walk up to them, right? First of all, you have to have permission to ask them a question. You have to present them with tobacco or some gift or some sign of respect, and then you might be granted the opportunity to ask a question. So, you know, I think it's things like this that are making people kind of come to this premature conclusion that question asking itself is a problem. Okay, so now I want to talk about my chapter on centering women. I argue that the way to include gender in this work is just to include it from the beginning, right? It's just at the center of the work. So we're not going to do philosophy and then we're going to add in feminist philosophy. No, that's the Western approach. We're not going to do that. And I say we have to have it at the center from the beginning. And so I'll give a brief explanation of that. In order to do this, so Western philosophy has a tendency to normalize men, add on discussions of the other, whether it's ethnic other, gendered other. Indigenous philosophers can refuse to segregate women and their scholarship into separate fields. We can refuse to accept artificial dichotomies that presuppose a tension between racial oppression and gender oppression. We already know what it's like to live raced and gendered lives. It's not two different things. And so we can just decide that we're going to make sure that issues related to gender, sexuality, and heteronormativity form an important part of the analysis from the beginning. And so such a method entails the privileging of voices, issues, concepts, symbols, and stories relevant to the lives of Indigenous women in the discipline. This methodology, as I propose it, includes 3 principal elements. You haven't figured out by now I like numbers. A concentrated effort to seek out women's voices in order to bring balance to literatures disproportionately dominated by male-defined representations of Native cultures. And just as a quick story, I told Dak I wasn't going to tell a lot of stories because of time, but a quick story, because I do like to tell stories. I submitted a version of this chapter to a journal, a Native journal, and the critique I got was there were not enough men cited in this article, right? So we got a problem, right? So I made sure, right? My book cites a lot of women and also two-spirited people. And so I also argue that we should retell women's stories and engage in a critical reclamation of traditional narratives. And that finally we should engage in gender-checking ideas before promoting them as important Indigenous philosophical topics. So there are some ideas that have been promoted which really don't pass the gender check test, like warrior culture, right? This idea that natives are just, it's from a warrior culture. Okay, and so then I give a rationale for this by talking about how there's been a traditional centering of women in Indigenous cultures, and I cite lots of Native scholars who've done research on this. And then I also talk about the fact that there are so many traditions, Indigenous traditions, where God was a woman, was and or is a woman. So we have sky woman, thought woman, corn woman, spider woman, first woman, right? And then I talk about balance. And I talk about balance in this chapter. I also talk about it under the theme of the importance of balance as it relates to gender. And so, a number of scholars have talked about how balance is such an important part of Native culture, and you have to have balance in all things, right? Between male and female, plant and climate, earth and water, right? Everything has to be in balance. And so we have to have balance between men and women, but we also have to have balance between sexualities. And then we also have to respect and accord space for two spirits. And two spirit is a traditional category in Native American cultures, which includes third and fourth genders. And it's traditional, and it's being reclaimed by more and more tribes. In fact, in Florida, my tribe now has a two-spirit society, which I couldn't believe. But it's everywhere, right? There's two-spirit societies everywhere. Tribes are recognizing. And so this is like a reclamation. And so when we actually have this focus on traditional notions of balance or harmony, or like Hozo, then those types of traditions really require a respect for gender and sexuality, equality, and kind of coexistence in a relationship of balance. Okay, so that's the first half of the book, talking about all of these questions and problems and how do we define the field and what's the methodology. And then the second half of the book is me talking about these 10 themes. And in each of these chapters where I discuss the themes, I then, cite lots of Native sources, and then I identify generative statements we can generate from the themes, and then I also ask questions. And so I'm going to give some examples of that. So the first recurrent theme I look at is the importance of land, place, and space. And then I go through and discuss all of these sub-themes. Land is important because it's a source of Indian identity. Land is important because it's sacred and is the source of ceremony. Land is important because it's the source of origin stories. And then I ask questions. And so here are some questions I ask about land and ceremony. If ceremony is a source of knowledge, can philosophers do ceremony as part of their philosophy? Or should they? Can philosophy be done as ceremony? Is philosophy restricted in the questions it can answer because it is not ceremony? How do we make rhetorical sense out of symbolic knowledge, and should we make sense of it? And then some generative statements that we can generate from this theme. To do philosophy, we must listen to the stories the land tells us. And so these statements, you'll notice, they're controversial, right? People might disagree with them. And so you can see that they could generate a debate or a discussion. Another one is the land speaks to us or teaches us, right? There's a lot of people who don't believe in that. Might say, what? But that might be an interesting debate to have. So another theme is land and responsibility. And then land as a source of philosophy. And then here's another set of questions we could ask. Is philosophy only possible outdoors? When I used to teach Native American philosophy, I used to take my students outside, and I used to make them talk to rocks and do all kinds of crazy stuff. Because if we have to be on the land to reflect, how do we do philosophy in a classroom, right? And so these are just examples of questions that Native philosophy raises for the whole discipline of philosophy. Okay, so another recurrent theme has to do with the importance of words and stories. Stories are sources of knowledge. Stories are linked to identity. Stories are important because they're linked to land. And then there's the idea that stories have power, that they are ontological beings. And so some of the questions I ask as a result of that are, what does it mean for philosophy if words are beings who have power, and if stories matter? If we include stories in our philosophy, will our philosophies be alive? How will they affect their listeners? Will they be dangerous? How dangerous is it to engage in oral philosophical discussion and debate, given what we know about the power of words? Okay. How are we? I'm looking at the clock. What's the time I have left?
How much time do we have?
Well, I can't remember what time we started.
Oh, I think it was like 5 after 2.
Okay. Oh, so I should be done now.
Anyway, but yeah, I mean.
So I'll just give maybe 1 or 2 more examples and then I'll close. And so I do that with all these themes. I come up with questions, I come up with statements. And so I'll just give, let's see, what's another last one to talk about? Okay, I have a whole section on knowledge and responsibility. And so here are some generative statements that are generated from that theme. Knowledge entails responsibility. To know is to be responsible for the knowledge one has. Transmitters of knowledge have a responsibility to make sure the recipients of their knowledge are ready. To know is to be responsible to the inner workings of the universe. 5, it is important to be ready for knowledge before receiving knowledge. 6, I forgot to number them. Imparting indigenous knowledge to non-indigenous persons can be dangerous and thus should be undertaken with great care. 7, epistemic motivation, or why people want to know a thing, should be considered in evaluating their search for knowledge. Knowledge should not be treated as a commodity. The more knowledge a person has, the more responsibility she has. Knowledge is properly construed as a gift. Those who share knowledge responsibly irresponsibly risk harm to themselves and their communities. 12, knowledge ought to be exchanged in the contents of reciprocal relationships. 13, having access to certain kinds of knowledge entails constraints on the behavior of the knower. Each person is responsible to the knowledge they have been entrusted with. Knowledge is power, and power can be used for good or evil. And some of those are direct quotes from some Native scholars. And so I'll just end with what next? So after we go through this process of identifying themes, asking questions, coming up with statements, what's next? What's next is that other philosophers are going to see this work and then they're going to come up with their own statements, their own questions, their critiques of these statements. And hopefully these questions and these statements and these themes are going to provoke dialogue and debate. I would like to argue that for those of us formulating the field, we must be aware of the fact that as formulators, we have the freedom to do things differently than they have been done elsewhere. We must recognize that numerous possibilities exist, that Native American philosophy may be a kind of philosophy barely recognizable as philosophy to current philosophers, and yet still be philosophy. That it may initiate a paradigm shift in the field of philosophy, that indeed we may be on the brink of an indigenous turn in philosophy. Regardless of what happens with the proposal made in this treatise, it is my hope that this elucidation of recurrent themes in indigenous cultures and this proposal for the formulation of an intellectually sovereign form of academic Native American philosophy will prove to be beneficial to Indian country and the discipline of philosophy in general, and to Native, First Nations, Aboriginal, and Indigenous philosophers in particular. Thank you. Most of it.
Huh? Yeah, no, yeah. Good timing, I think. Thanks so much for your talk. I really appreciate it. We have time for dialogue. If anyone has questions.
Questions, comments, critiques.
Wonderings, musings.
Yes.
I have 2 questions. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about your method. yeah, I know that it's really hard to kind of go into a deep dive when you have a really limited amount of time. So yeah, I would love to hear more about the method.
Yeah, I think I was trying to discuss it without reading the whole book. So those problems I talked about at the beginning, those really form the foundation of how I was going to look for information. I wanted to avoid all those problems, and so I'll tell you a little bit about that process. I went to the Seminole Reservation. I'm Seminole, but I'm not from the reservation. And when I was young, I went there, and I was talking to elders, and I was like, I want to do Seminole philosophy. And so I talked to all these people, grandmothers, clan mothers, cultural director, chief of the tribe, and they were all fine with it. But what I quickly realized is that I was not going to be able to overcome all of the problems of translation and the problems of identity. And I, as a mixed blood, urban, non-Miccosukee speaking, I was there to try to learn Miccosukee. It was too hard. It's a tonal language and not written. And I'm a visual learner, so I did try to learn it. I did not do a good job. And so I realized that was going to be a serious problem of translation, right? I have to translate it from Miccosukee to English, and then the language has concepts embedded in it. And then also the language I learned from my teacher, is very land-based. And so I was like, I would have to really live here. And I don't live here. I'm going to school in California. I'm in a PhD program, right? And so the problems of translation were a problem. And then there was problems of identity, right? I'm not from there. I'm from Chicago. I'm mixed blood, right? And so I kind of pivoted to, okay, I need to do something that's pan-tribal, that's urban, that's English, right? I need to do something that relates to where I'm coming from, my context, what I have the authority to speak about. And also I need to eliminate these problems of translation. I can't be going and hanging out on the reservation and talking to elders and trying to learn, right? I don't want to do ethnography, right? And I don't want to use the ethnography of others because there's problems of translation there, right? And it's really funny because when you read, I remember when I was quite young, when I was in the library reading books about the Seminole, and I would just be in the library laughing, and the librarian's like, shh, be quiet. Because the stories, right, that people would tell the anthropologists, they weren't true, right? But they were funny. And the Seminole are really especially known for this. Very, very secretive people, do not share hardly anything, right? And so, so then I was like, okay, how can I get at what are the most important things? I'm going to have to be pan-tribal, not tribal. I'm going to have to look at, and I said, let me look at the intellectual production, because that way the vetting has already been done, right? Who am I to vet, right? Who am I to say, is this an authentic Laguna Pueblo? I don't know, right? I'm not Laguna Pueblo. So what did I do? I said, I'm going to look at the Laguna Pueblo writers, right? Simon Ortiz, now I'm forgetting all the names, but there's a whole bunch of them. And I'll just read everything they wrote. Or I'll just read everyone who, so my criteria then was native speakers or writers who were, who appeared to have a sense of accountability to their tribes or their culture. And obviously that's not a perfect method, because there are some people I cited in here that later on people discredited, like Andrea Smith, I cited her, and then people later were like, well, she's not really native, right? And so obviously I'm not going to always know. But that was my method, was let me pick people who have already kind of committed themselves to representing their tribe in writing. And that was how I thought I could make it, address the problems of identity. And so then because there wasn't a lot that was written, that was explicitly Native American philosophy, I just read very widely in all disciplines, and I was just looking for anything critical, analytical, anything reflective, anyone saying, this is important to my people. And then collecting all of that and coming up with a list of all of these important things, and then narrowing it down to 10. and then going through and, kind of subjecting those themes to, questioning and reflection to come up with statements. And like I said, there are some people that say, oh, propositional knowledge isn't native, argumentation. But what I say is, there are a few approaches we can take, right? If you don't want to do propositional knowledge, you don't want to do argumentation, let's just have discussions. Let's just ask questions. There are so many different ways to do philosophy. And so I tried to create a method that really included the different ways that I have heard articulated by Native people as how philosophy is done in a Native context. Did I answer that?
Yeah, definitely. Thank you. It's such a labor of love, like such a process to.
Yeah, I mean, this book took me a couple decades to finish, or to get published, I should say. Yeah, definitely a labor of love. More questions? Critiques? I also welcome critiques. Yes.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. My name is Sharon. I'm a citizen of the Navajo Nation, and I found this so helpful just for me personally. I'm a PhD candidate here, so I'm starting my dissertation soon. And I took pages of notes because I feel like I really related to a lot of things you were talking about, even like questioning what you have the authority to speak on as like a Native scholar and somebody. Yeah, so I was just thinking through all that. I'm also teaching a course currently about remutation and gender and sexuality as it pertains to the environment in the environmental studies department here. And something that I've been really purposeful in doing is bringing in thinkers and scholars who aren't published or who don't have the traditional place in academia. And I was wondering how you thought about that in this book and just kind of in your work. I think about some of the Indigenous and Two-Spirit folks who post a lot of think pieces on Instagram and but haven't totally published a lot of them.
Yeah. Well, this book was finished before I got really heavily involved in social media, or I might have included more of that. But I do have a section where I talk about the problem of tradition. And I did include orations in here. So I didn't just include published works, but I also looked for like documented orations, people who had spoken and their words had been written down, so that it wasn't limited just to those who were literate in English, right? So that's one way I got at that. And the thing is, I decided, Vine Deloria said we should look at ethnographic studies, and I decided against that. I just felt that it was too problematic in terms of the motivations behind the ethnographers and the whole field. And I say that as somebody who worked briefly for a professor in anthropology, and so I got to learn a little bit of the methodology, and I got to see how problematic it was, because the person I worked for was a white woman. We went to the Caribbean. It was very problematic. And so certainly if I had chosen to go that route and look at ethnographic texts, we could have gotten more voices who were not intellectuals or who were not published. But that was I just decided I couldn't overcome those problems of conquest in that literature. I do think that going forward, now that we do have Native people doing ethnography in Native communities, there's been this turn, in anthropology. I started this book so long ago that there are parts of it like that maybe are outdated, and that when I was writing it, anthropology wasn't yet there. It was starting to go in that direction. I think that now it's possible to, it would be possible to bring in accounts of Native speakers that were documented by Native ethnographers, and in that way, bring more people in. Now, I do talk in the book about orality, and I do identify it as a problem. Just the fact that this is a written text is problematic, right? Because so much wisdom in Native context is passed down orally, and it's not going to be written down, and it can't be written down. So for example, in my tribe, the Seminole tribe, there's a book out. Betty Mae Jumper put out this book of Seminole legends, and there were some people who said she should not do that. that she shouldn't even tell stories to non-Seminole people. So there are a lot of restrictions in different communities about what can and should become a written text. And so that was a problem from the beginning, and it's still a problem, that what's in this book is not going to be able to convey what is conveyed orally. There is so much, and I say this as someone who does a lot of oral work, performance. The performance cannot be reduced to the page. And so that's a limitation of this work, and it's one that I can't overcome. Yeah. But maybe in the future, maybe in your work, you could create a multimedia publication, right? That includes oral performance, video, posting, right? And text. And maybe that's the future.
Thank you.
I actually have a,
Okay, good.
So I really appreciate how you define philosophy as reflection, dialogue, and the persistent asking of questions, rather than the disciplining of philosophy that we've inherited through the university. And one of the things that I was reflecting on, listening to, was the relationship to institutions themselves, right? You are implicit to what you're arguing and saying, right? There's an involvement, right, with academic universities. And so I don't know if you could share some thoughts on that, like how that is also, should we stay out of the universities because they're, Western institutions and therefore we should avoid them,
Mm-hmm.
or, right,
Or do we tear them down and rebuild them?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So tear them down, but what is that process? Right?
Yeah.
And like the ethnic studies history, right, of fighting to be in the institution, right? So yeah, like I'm just curious to hear what you're.
Okay, so I'll try to answer that question, but I'm gonna give a disclaimer at the beginning by saying that I'm no longer in academia. So I escaped. I'm no longer. So I might be considered a failed academic, right? So maybe you don't want to listen to me. So I did get tenure, and then I left. So I published this book as a non-academic. So after leaving academia, I published this book. I mean, I had a contract for this book when I was an academic, but because of police brutality and like all kinds of stuff that I went through, it didn't happen. And so yeah, the academic institution is highly problematic, and that's been my personal experience. I had to fight the entire time I was in academia to try to do the work that I was doing. I was under, persistent hostile attack by other intellectuals, predominantly white males, but not only. And so yeah, the question, is a good one. Should this work be done in the academy, or are we sacrificing too many people to make that happen? Like I was one of the sacrifices. And and there were others before me, right? Viola Cordova, who I call the grandmother of Native, she was a sacrifice. She was never able to get a tenure track position in philosophy. She went from institution to institution. She died too young. There have been a lot of sacrifices. So I think it's one path, one possibility. I think what's valuable about doing this work in the academy is that there's a way in which change happens in our society that often involves academia. And so when I was fresh out of college, I got involved in this organization in Oakland called the Black United Front for Educational Reform. And they were trying to change the high school curriculum to include Black studies. And back then there were no Black studies. This was in the 80s. And so we were a group of like community members, activists. I was an activist, teachers, right? And as we were trying to make change in the school system, we found out that we had to trot out our PhD every time we wanted to do an event. We had this one PhD and we would trot him out, professor at a local college, and they would only listen to him. And we also found out that in order to get the textbooks changed in the school, there had to have been academic texts that were written first that the textbooks were based on, and that there was a shortage of scholars who were writing revisionist Black history. And so I went and got my master's in history because I thought, oh, I could change the world this way. And so there is that factor that when academics change things, there's a way in which it then allows high schools and grade schools to change the way they teach things. And also those bodies of knowledge or those areas of expertise can then be used to legitimate certain movements. And so for some people, that's a good reason to work in the academy, because if you care about social change, you might want to take that strategy. Like that was the strategy I took. And the reason I worked in the academy, as long as I did, is because I thought I could make change that way. Obviously, there are other ways to make change. And we certainly do give up a lot by trying to work in this setting. Certainly, as I was writing this book, what I did was I went around and I gave talks from chapters in this book to Native intellectual communities. So like at UCLA, I was giving talks in Native American Studies. And then I went to Canada to the Indigenous Feminisms Conference where we had Native women from all over Turtle Island, which was amazing. And there were all these elders there and they gave me advice, right? So this is academic, but also community. So a lot of Native academic stuff involves community. Also in the APA, the American Philosophical Association, where I gave a lot of talks on this book, we would have these panels of Native philosophers, and then all the Native Americans in the area would come to our panels. So they were not academics, they were community members, and they informed our work. And so it is possible, I think, to be in academia and to still include, community in how you, write your work, design your work, create your work. But there are also, inherent limitations, ways that we have to write, places that we have to publish, the publishers. If you choose an academic publisher, they're not going to publish something that, an independent press who's more focused on social justice is gonna publish. So yeah, it's one path. Academia is one path. I do think it can be powerful though, because for example, this book, I Got Big Plans. There's no book like this. So when there's no book, then people can make the argument that there's no thing, right? And we might disagree with that's silly. But if we're thinking strategically, having the book out there makes it easier to argue that there's this thing. And then once you can make that argument, then you can argue, okay, well now we need to develop a whole program on this. We need to develop a whole conference on this. We need to start training students to do this. We need to start putting money into community intellectual collaborations around Native philosophy and how it can inform, right? But I didn't write this book just for academics. So I wrote it in a way that I think is accessible. I guess I'll find out when people tell me if it's accessible, but I wrote it in a way that my anticipation is that Native organizations can use this book. So I've worked in Native organizations, and this was also a motivation for me. I was working in urban Native organizations where we were always trying to find ways to do things that other organizations are doing, but from a Native perspective, right? So like, I remember I was working for this one United Indian Nations in Oakland, and we were wanting to create like healing community for women, and we didn't want to do it the way like Western medicine does it, like counseling. We were like, oh, we want to do it in a Native way, and so they asked me to help them write this grant, and I was talking about the medicine wheel and how can we create talking circles and how can we make it really consistent with Native culture. Well, I think there's a lot of Native organizations out there like that are looking for a resource that feels like it's really authentically drawing from Native culture and but can be used today, like in a modern urban context. And so I feel like I used the academic book as a strategic point for change. And we'll see if I was successful, but that was certainly the intention.
Yeah, no, I fully agree. I think it's going to be super helpful for discussions and like debate, like discussing the difficult questions, that come up from intercultural dialogues and sort of things. So
this might be, I don't know if this is too granular from all the things that you've shared with us. Oh, and thank you for everything that you've shared with us. You know how you mentioned, I guess, under discussing the current themes, the stories as ontological beings, right? And energy, beings of energy. So I'm just wondering, do you have a lean? Do you have a lean on that? Like,
do I have a what?
A lean or a position, if you will. With
a
regards
position.
To, like with regards to if that's true, then what of sharing it, and I guess the responsibilities of sharing and not sharing, because right, like, because I think that the idea was stories as ontological beings, so what of telling stories in teaching philosophy? I think that was the idea.
Yeah, so I am a storyteller.
Yeah.
And I didn't tell stories today because we didn't have time. But I feel very strongly about the fact that stories are ontological beings. So there are people like Thomas King and Leslie Marmon Silko. Leslie, how do I say it? Marmon Silko. At least those two are the most well-known scholars who've talked about stories as beings. But I feel like it's also something I learned at home. My grandmother was a storyteller as well. She even had her own radio show. And so storytellers have a responsibility. And we don't get to just tell any stories in any kind of way to anybody at any time under any circumstances. We have to take seriously the fact that once the words leave our mouth, we have no control of them. They go on to have an independent existence, independent of us. I mean, they continue on, and they move out in the world. And of course, that's true with written words as well, right? Texts are dangerous as well. And so I do think that philosophy should include storytelling. And I used to do a lot of public presentations, and I created this thing I called philopoetics, where I would combine storytelling, poetry, and philosophy. And it wasn't, it was similar to Gloria Anzaldua's work, but not identical, because she wasn't actually a philosopher. She was more of a critical, like, literary theorist. And so, but certainly I was influenced by her, right? And Shri Moraga and lots of native storytellers. But I do think, in my opinion, that, the oral approach, including storytelling and poetry, is probably the ideal way to do philosophy. Because the oral, the performative storytelling, you get the ideas, but you get something more. You get the emotion, you get the energy, you get the ability to change reality in the moment in a way that you can't do with a written text. So I do feel really strongly about that. I originally had, I talk about it a little bit here. I originally had a huge chapter on it that I took out because somebody else published something before I did, and I said, well, I don't want to cite them because I wrote mine first. That was my ego. I'll just take it out. Just keeping it real. So I do think it's really important, and I think a lot of us who were raised in certain cultures, and it's not just Native culture. I think in Black cultures and African cultures and in Indigenous cultures around the world, there's this tradition that we see of wisdom being passed down in stories. And here's the thing about a story. You gotta work, right? If someone tells you a story, they're not giving you the answers. It's not all spelled out, right? You have to think about it and try to figure out, what does that mean? Why'd they tell me that story, right? And it kind of respects you as an individual because it gives you the freedom. It assumes that you have the intellectual wherewithal to really answer your own question with a little bit of help, right? I'll give a example. So I'm a healer and a ceremonial person, and throughout my life I got different trainings. And at one point I was told by so I'm a dreamer, and I was told by my grandmothers in a dream to go do 4 sweats. Sweat is a ceremony, Lakota-based ceremony, but it's actually practiced by lots of tribes now. And I was sick at the time. And so my understanding from the dream was that if I were to do this ceremony, I would get better. And so I wasn't, I was not feeling well, so I was a little scared. Like, oh, I gotta go and do this challenging ceremony, right? Because it involves being in heat. And so I got then invited to a ceremony coincidentally, that week, right? Because spirit. And I go to the ceremony, and as soon as I get there, the fire keeper walks up to me. I mean, I had just gotten there. And she says to me, "You're a fire keeper, I'm gonna train you." And I said, no. I'm here because my grandmother sent me to get 4 sweats because I'm sick. I'm not here to be a fire keeper. And she was like, "No, you are. I can tell." And this is the way I've gotten most of my training in life, right? People dragging me. And so, "No, you are." And I said, "Well, I don't know, what to tell you." And she said, "Well, I think you should talk to the sweat lodge leader and ask her for advice." And so I said, okay. And so I went and got my tobacco, and I went over to the sweat lodge leader, and I told her, "This is what my grandmother said. This is what this fire keeper of yours is telling me. I don't know what to do." She did not give me an answer, right? She told me a story. She said, "Well, I knew this guy once." That's how they all start, right? "I knew this guy once, and his ancestors told him he had to do a sweat, but then he was also told that he had to be a fire keeper. And so you know what he did? He would heat up those stones. He would carry those stones. It's hard work being a fire keeper. He would carry those stones, and then he would come in the lodge and sweat with us every round, and then he would go out and get those stones." And she said, "It's really, really hard work, but it's possible." And so she told me that story, and then I had to decide for myself, is that something I was willing to do, right? She didn't tell me to do it. She didn't tell me I should do it. She told me a story, and I decided whether or not I saw myself in that story, right? And it's one of the things I talk about in the book is how sometimes when you ask a question, you get a story. It doesn't mean that you're not supposed to ask the question. It means that that question is not meant to be answered in that way that you think it was. It's meant to be answered through this process of reflection. And so stories are like that. I mean, that story was, kind of simple. Sometimes the stories are a lot more subtle, right? And there's a lot of symbols. It's like a traditional story. Instead of having like someone who so closely matched me, they might have said, "Well, there was this turtle, right? And the turtle was carrying rocks on their back. And then they got to the river, and the frog said, 'Hey, turtle, I need you to help me. I need you to help me carry sticks.' And the turtle said, 'Well, I got rocks on my back. How am I going to carry sticks?' And the frog says, 'Well, I had this friend once.'" Right? So, stories can be told with all these layers and different symbols depending on the context and who's telling you. And and then it's for you to kind of work through interpreting those symbols. And then a lot of stories will have multiple layers. So that's when I talked about the multiplicity of meaning as a problem of translation. Because sometimes we want to take something symbolic and we want to, let's turn it into philosophy. Earth is our mother, and so that means, right? And then we try to come up with kind of simplistic understandings of that. We could kind of spell out, like with all my numbers, right? I want to write the numbers. But then there's all of these other meanings in there that require sometimes years to understand. And so sometimes a story that you're told when you're young, it's years later that you understand everything that was in that story, right? Because there are those layers of meaning. And that's what makes stories so rich conceptually, right? In philosophy, we care about concepts. And stories are really conceptually rich, but they require reflection, interpretation, context, knowing about the symbol, the cultural symbols, right? And sometimes they just require time and maturity, right? So there are stories I was told when I was young that I only came to understand much later. So I think that's the power of stories.
Is it okay if we start having food?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. So thank you so much, Jennifer. There's food for everyone, and there's also free posters here. If you would like a poster from the event, you can